Hello everyone, this is Jerry. I'm a 37-year-old autistic adult, and due to recent events, I unfortunately have to make another video about a certain someone I hoped I'd never have to ever again, and that person is Christian Weston Chandler, aka Chris Chan. Now, before I begin, I'll give a brief disclaimer I did in my last video because this covers disturbing subject matter. Discretion is kind of advised a bit, and although Christian identifies as trans, he's admitted that his motivation for this is to it's in the hopes that it would get him laid. And I said before, and I'll say it again, that I refuse to play into that, especially after all the information I've recently learned about a paraphilia called AGP, which you can look up if you don't know what it is, and have a spare barf bag handy. And this most likely also played into his quote-unquote transition. Now, I'm not going to reiterate everything I already said on Chris Chan, as you can see my prior video linked in the description, or look him up. To make a long story short, I made a video about Chris Chan, a then 39-year-old autistic adult who was arrested for raping his then 79-year-old dementia patient mother 2 years ago. I made the video after some internal debate, along with some advice from others I trusted, because while Chris Chan was and still is an extreme case that doesn't represent the majority of autistic people, I also saw him as a massive warning sign for what could potentially happen to an autistic person if they have bad parents, don't get the help they need, are subject to unrelenting bullying and trolling, and have other untreated mental conditions on top of that. I'm no doctor, but in Chris Chan's case, most likely he also had schizoaffective disorder, as well as, of course, playing the victim to avoid responsibility for their actions in any efforts to help themselves. I believed back then and still believe now that despite my concerns of the potential risk of inadvertently contributing to the train wreck effect of internet trolls encouraging someone who is obviously severely mentally ill to continue to ruin his life while bystanders look on in shock and horror for their entertainment, that I made the right decision in making that video and hope I am making the right decision in making this follow-up. The reason for this follow-up is the recent news that all charges against Chris Chan have been dropped. And unless there are some stipulations to his release that have not become publicly available or that I'm somehow missing, it seems he's, legally speaking, completely off the hook and just free to go. For those of you wondering how this could possibly happen, I'm honestly as confused and horrified as you are. Now bear in mind I'm not a lawyer, but from what I understand of the case, Chris Chan was never charged with rape, but was charged with incest, which in most jurisdictions in this case his state of Virginia, is regarded as a crime. And even if said incest committed was consensual, which in this case it probably wasn't. Now, this may perhaps be due to the fact that the prosecution may have thought they may not have had enough evidence to pursue rape charges, but had enough evidence to pursue incest charges. But, they haven't released any public statements, and there's no other evidence I'm aware of. So, again, this is speculation on my part, so take it for what you will. So, while the trial was pending, Chris Chan did spend almost 2 years in jail, though, was released last March into what appears to be the custody of some kind of halfway house or group home via court order with a psych evaluation. Seems like the original plan was to keep Chris Chan in the institution for the rest of the trial, but with this recent decision by the judge, the trial obviously will not continue any further. Details regarding the case over the course of the trial have been sparse, but with that likely being due to protective orders by the judge to attempt to prevent the trial from being as much of a circus as possible, as well as to protect Chris Chan from himself as well as trolls, and I'll give the judge some credit for that. Yet on the other hand, he released somebody he knew is a threat to himself and others. The judge for this may possibly, at least in part, be because his hands were tied, legally speaking. So for now, at least, I'm giving him at least some sliver of the benefit of the doubt, not the full, but just a bit. Now, remember watching the Geno Samuel documentary on Chris Chan? Yeah, somehow I subjected myself to that torture, and don't ask me why. And one trend I noticed in the later episodes is that there are multiple attempts to get adult protective services to intervene, but that they were told that they, legally speaking, didn't have enough evidence to do so. Now, I found out about this particular provision in Virginia state law that was ironically passed shortly before Chris Chan's arrest that may at least partially explain this. This particular section says, in any criminal case except violation of 18.2 through 31, an act of violence is defined in 19.2 through 297.1, or any crime for which a deferred deposition is provided for statute upon a plea of guilty or a plea of not guilty, and the facts found by the court would justify finding of guilt. The court may, if the defendant has been diagnosed by a psychiatrist or clinical psychologist with an autism spectrum disorder as defined in the most recent edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders published by the American Psychiatric Association, or an intellectual disability as defined in 37.2 through 100, and the court finds by clear and convincing evidence that the criminal conduct was caused by or had a direct or substantial relationship to the person's disorder or disability without entering a judgment of guilt and with the consent of the accused, after giving due consideration to the position of the attorney for the Commonwealth and the views of the victim, defer further proceedings and place the accused on probation subject to terms and conditions set by the court. Upon violation of a term or condition, the court may enter an adjudication of guilt, or upon fulfillment of the terms and conditions, the court may discharge the person and dismiss the proceedings against him without an adjudication of guilt. This section shall not limit the authority of any juvenile or domestic relations courts granted to it in Title 16.1. Now, since the charges were dropped, it appears the proviso of the court being able to, quote, discharge the person and dismiss the proceedings against him without an admission of guilt is probably the most relevant one in this particular instance. It seems like if you have autism, you can apparently get away with rape in the state of Virginia if you have a decent lawyer and who can convince a psychologist or psychiatrist to tell the court that their client's crime was caused by, quote, substantial relationship to the person's disorder or disability. Now, granted, his mother's mental state likely made her mentally incapable of testifying in any meaningful way, but this is still a horrifying outcome. As I've said in the prior video, Chris Chan should be locked up in an institution for the rest of his life, and I frankly don't understand how or why that didn't happen here. You would think Chris Chan would meet the legal definition of insanity in the state of Virginia, but then they also have one of the most poorly written and frankly rather insulting laws regarding autistic people I have ever seen. While the question of how legally culpable an autistic person is for crimes committed is a bit complicated one due to it being a broad spectrum, even if Chris Chan never went all Sweet Home Alabama on us, it's clear that he is a danger to himself and others and is completely incapable of ever taking care of himself, and that he has a knowledge of right and wrong, albeit an extremely rudimentary one. As a matter of fact, most autistic people do know the difference between right and wrong. It's the cases that are even more severe than Chris Chan's, that where they have they're severely mentally challenged. Those are the ones where you could maybe argue they don't know the difference between right and wrong. Now, anyway, this is a bad outcome because it not only infantilizes autistic people by seemingly giving them a literal get-out-of-jail-free card for horrific crimes, but also makes more autistic adults fall into the cracks of a failing mental health care system where in many cases the most serious cases are ignored because the system would just rather send them on their way instead of actually doing the job taxpayers are supposedly paying them to do. They say they get what you pay for, but when it comes to government programs, it usually seems to be the opposite. Anyway, this tragic case makes yet another example of how completely and totally broken both the criminal justice system as well as the mental health care system in America in general, or rather Virginia in particular, is. While institutionalization is not the answer for most cases of autism in particular and neurodivergence in general, this is one of those clear-cut cases where it obviously is. It makes me wonder how many more cases are out there that were simply dismissed by courts because they either don't know what to do with somebody or they would just rather not deal with the problem. 50 years or so ago, society used to institutionalize nearly anyone that showed any signs of neurodivergence or mental health issues, and while we today clearly No, this was the wrong approach. It seems like in many cases like this one, we may actually be veering off into the other extreme by refusing to institutionalize someone, where it's clearly the right thing to do in such obvious cases like this. Now, a friend of mine knows someone personally who is an even greater threat to himself and others, who actually spent a similar amount of time in jail as Chris Chan, yet was released despite the fact that he threatened to shoot numerous people, including some political figures. But those are extreme cases, some of you will say, and you're right. But that brings us to the question of what about the cases involving autistic adults that aren't dire enough for them to get into the criminal justice system, but, still in the mental health care system in some capacity? While this video initially is about Christian, it really isn't at the same time, but is more about the system itself. The cases I'm referring to here are the ones where autistic adults end up falling through the cracks because they don't have the supports they actually need. Autistic children have more supports than ever before. Granted, there have been steps backward thanks to gender ideologies I pointed out in a previous video, but many other things have improved. When I was diagnosed at age 2 back in 1988, the doctor said I'd never get an IQ past 50, would never amount to anything, and should be institutionalized. My parents didn't listen to him, instead opting for a second opinion, and eventually led them to an experimental program at UCSD that would later form much of the basis for standard autism treatment. Chris Chan is 4 years older than me and did not go through any such programs, at least that I'm aware of. And him being slightly older than me is likely part of the reason for this discrepancy. His own parents are much older than mine as well, and were in part due to that unprepared to raise a child quite like that. Now, many of these autistic children and teenagers who get support later grow up, still need support, yet have much more difficult time getting it due to aging out of a lot of supports they had previously. The unemployment rate for autistic adults is over 66%, making autism the form of neurodivergence with the highest rate of unemployment. These statistics are alarming, and if not addressed soon, will result in much of the progress over the years going down the drain, and I refuse to sit and watch that happen. Now, there are many reasons for these depressing numbers, which warrant a video in and of itself, but the main takeaway of this video is that while you do have examples of successful autistic adults like yours truly, there are many that are not, and one of the main reasons for this is the system itself simply doesn't know how to handle us. I bring this up not to hand out black pills to everyone, but to bring up the fact that the work of autism advocacy is far from over. When I was first diagnosed, treatment was practically non-existent for autistic children as well as adults, and we were only a few decades removed from doctors' widely accepted refrigerator mother hypothesis, which was a belief that autism was caused by cold, uncaring mothers. In my mid-childhood years, autism was starting to enter mainstream consciousness, with many important battles being fought and won. My mother, along with other parents, helped found the San Diego chapter of the Autism Society and established many of the supports used by children in the area today. Now, in my adult years, we're now seeing adult issues start to enter mainstream consciousness the same way autism in general did, but we're also seeing internal divisions within the autism community because autistic people, as well as parents of autistic people, are kind of a little divided amongst each other and themselves. Now, this is partially due to bad actors in the autism community, as I pointed out in a prior video, but it's also partially due to legitimate differences of opinion that have unfortunately gotten a bit out of hand. Some autistic people are set in our ways, which can lead to black and white thinking, which can lead to some of us missing important nuances. The nuance here is that while Christian clearly is an extreme case, it doesn't represent most autistic people. I clearly understand that. For those of you to bring it up, it is also a rather blatant indictment of the criminal justice and mental health care system. The latter of which nearly all autistic people are involved in to some extent at some point in their lives, even though most autistic people are not in prison or mental institutions. It's commonplace, again, for many of us to rely on mental health care services to some capacity. Now, things have improved a great deal in many ways, as I've said before, but I'll say again that the work of autism advocacy is far from over, yet, despite this fact, we shouldn't despair. We've already made so much progress as it is. We just have a bit more work still left to do.